September 3rd, 1942, 22:47 hours, 18,000 feet above the blacked-out rooftops of East London. The air was not empty. It was a vibrating, chaotic soup of frozen particulates, concussive thunder, and lethal geometry. Searchlight fingers, frantic and skeletal, clawed at the clouds. Below, the dull, blooming roses of fire marked where the Baedeker Blitz was etching its signature into the city. Above, the drone of 100 German engines was a continuous, oppressive growl. In this bedlam, Flight Lieutenant James Gull Bennett of No. 151 Squadron nursed his Hawker Hurricane through the shrapnel-laced dark. His eyes, strained against the flak flashes and glare, tracked a shape ahead. A Dornier 217, its twin-tailed silhouette stark against a sudden burst of light. A solid, high-flying bomber. A standard kill. He radioed his position, a calm, clipped report, lost in the etheric crackle. He began his approach, the ritual of the hunt. Close the distance, steady the wobbling gun sight on the vast back of the enemy. Then, the Dornier did something a Dornier should not do. It seemed to convulse. A shudder ran through its airframe. From its spine, just behind the cockpit, a shape detached. Not a piece of wreckage, not a scared crewman bailing out. This shape dropped cleanly, then pulled up sharply, its own engine, a different, higher-pitched snarl coming to life. In seconds, the lumbering bomber had given violent mechanical birth to a sleek, predatory Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter. Gull's breath fogged his oxygen mask. His mind, trained for dogfights and beam attacks, rejected the image. It was a perversion of physics, a tactical impossibility. The 109, now free and agile, banked hard not to flee, but to cover the Dornier. It positioned itself between the bomber and the stunned Hurricane. This was no chance encounter. This was a planned, parasitic delivery, a mothership and its lethal young. Over the RT, the calm professionalism of the RAF channel shattered. Voices overlapped, sharp with disbelief. Black 2 confirmed visual on that Dornier 217. It just shed a fighter. It's a 109. Where the hell did it come from? Jesus, it's escorting the bloody thing. In the cockpit, Gull's targeting calculation, a simple matter of deflection and speed, evaporated. The calculus of the night had changed. He wasn't intercepting a bomber. He was walking into an ambush that had been flying hidden in plain sight for hundreds of miles. The 109 pilot, fresh, his fuel untouched by the long penetration flight, now held the energy advantage. The hunter had become the hunted. And in that frozen moment, a terrifying question flashed through every pilot in the sector. How many more of these monsters were out there in the dark? The contraption Flight Lieutenant James Gull Bennett saw splitting the sky was not a product of spontaneous genius, but of calculated desperation. Its origins trace back to a quiet manor house in England, not a German design bureau. While the Luftwaffe perfected its composite bomber, British designers pursued a radically different, almost heretical idea, an unarmed bomber made of wood. At Salisbury Hall, a team led by de Havilland's chief engineer, Ronald Bishop, worked in secrecy. Their concept, the DH-98, was born from a simple, ruthless logic. If an aircraft was fast enough, it wouldn't need guns. They proposed a twin-engine machine built from spruce and plywood to conserve precious metal, so sleek it was calculated to outrun a Spitfire. To the bomber orthodoxists in the Air Ministry, it was insanity. They demanded turrets, a third crewman, and dismissed the design as Freeman's folly, a slight against its champion, Air Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman. Yet Freeman's advocacy and the pressing need for a long-range reconnaissance plane forced the project through. The prototype took shape in 1940, a wooden phantom. When it finally flew, it was a revelation. The Mosquito was not just fast, it was a predator, a ghost in the air. Its impact was immediate. As the Mosquito entered service in late 1941, it began a campaign of surgical terror against the Reich. It flew so high and fast that German interceptors scrambled too late, if at all. It was the Mosquito that, on the 10th anniversary of the Nazis' rise to power, cut off Hermann Göring's live radio broadcast with a perfectly timed bomb strike on Berlin's main broadcasting station. Each successful raid was a stinging humiliation for Göring and a direct challenge to the concept of Fortress Europe. The psychological blow was as severe as the physical damage. The Luftwaffe, the proud instrument of blitzkrieg, could not protect its own heartland from a wooden plane. This relentless, unstoppable mosquito bite of a war is what drove the German High Command to seek a counterpunch not just of equal force, but of shocking, grotesque ingenuity. The answer was not born from a desire for elegance, but from a need to restore fear. If Britain could send an unescorted bomber deep into Germany, Germany would send an escorted bomber even deeper into Britain. The Dornier 217, a capable but vulnerable workhorse already pounding English cities during the Baedeker Blitz, would be the vessel, but it would not go alone. Thus, the Beethoven was conceived, a Parasite fighter, a Messerschmitt Bf 109, physically mounted atop the bomber. The fighter would carry the bomber through defended airspace like a remora on a shark, then detach to clear its path or defend it on the return trip. It was a tactical brute, a direct response to the Mosquito's elegant speed. One was a scalpel, the other a mailed fist. And on that September night over London, as Gull Bennett stared in disbelief, the fist was unclenching. The 109 pilot, his cockpit perched where no cockpit should be, had ridden for hundreds of miles in the bomber's slipstream. Now, released, he was fresh, fully fueled, and angry. He banked his Messerschmitt not toward home, but toward the hurricane. The long-range escort mission was over. The hunt was on. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, now a free and lethal entity, did not behave like a standard interceptor. Its pilot, Oberleutnant Klaus Hahn, executed a sharp, climbing turn that spoke of fresh energy reserves. He hadn't burned fuel fighting through the coastal defenses. He had been carried there, a stowaway of violence. For Flight Lieutenant Gull Bennett, the calculus of the dogfight was instantly, terrifyingly reversed. Gull's Hurricane, already strained from a patrol circuit, felt suddenly heavy. He threw the aircraft into a defensive spiral, the G-force pressing him into his seat. The searchlight beams, moments ago tools for targeting the bomber, now became dizzying strobes, disorienting and blinding. Over the RT, the chatter was frantic, confused. It came from the bomber. I swear it, the 109 was on its back. Dornier is turning southeast, increasing speed. The fighter is covering its tail. Gull, brake left now. Hahn's attack was not the wild spray of a defensive pilot. It was precise, economical. He fired a short, snapping burst of 20mm cannon fire that ripped through the empty air where Gull's Hurricane had been a half-second before. The Germans' advantage was total, mental surprise and physical fuel. Gull was fighting on the defensive, his mind still reeling from the impossible sight, his aircraft running on the dregs of its patrol endurance. Below them, the Dornier DO-217, now lighter by several tons and free of its parasitic burden, pitched its nose down and began to run. Its mission had already shifted. It was no longer a bomber in a formation, but a single ship unleashed, its fighter-borne escort having created a bubble of chaos in its wake. Gull knew he couldn't chase the bomber. The 109 was the immediate, mortal threat. He pulled a hard turn, trying to get his gun sights on the flickering silhouette of the Messerschmitt as it crossed another searchlight's beam. For a split second, he saw it clearly, the standard Luftwaffe splinter camouflage, but with an odd, clean line along its spine, a telltale sign of the special mounting frame that had shackled it to the Dornier. The aerial duel was a brutal, short affair. Gull was a skilled pilot, but he was fighting a ghost from a new rulebook. After a series of weaving scissor turns that drained his speed, Hahn broke off. He didn't press for the kill. His objective was clear: screen the bomber's escape. With a final, almost dismissive wing waggle, the 109 dove away into the ink-black Thames estuary, following the path of its mothership, leaving gulls circling in exhausted, stunned fury over a burning city. Back at Debden Airfield an hour later, the intelligence officer didn't believe him. The debrief was tense, the air thick with cigarette smoke and skepticism. A fighter, you say, launched from a DO-217? Not launched, sir. It was attached, like a backpack. It detached and engaged. Flight lieutenant, the strain of night fighting, the flak, the shadows, it can conjure phantoms. Gull's fist hit the table. It was no phantom. It had cannon. It nearly took my wing off. It was only when the reports filtered in from observer corps posts on the coast, vague, confused messages about a single Dornier tracked out, accompanied by a lone fighter that seemed to appear from nowhere, that the skepticism turned to cold, dread realization. Gull's testimony was the first piece of a puzzle no one wanted to solve. If the Germans could deliver a fresh fighter to the heart of London's airspace, then no bomber stream was ever truly alone again. The threat wasn't just a new aircraft, it was a new idea. And ideas are harder to shoot down.
The entity that attacked Gull Bennett was not a one-off field modification. It was Weisung 223, a top priority directive from the Reichs Luftfahrtministerium, assigned to the Junkers and DFS research bureaus. The British called the concept composite aircraft. The Germans, with a flair for the dramatic, named their specific program Beethoven Gerät, the Beethoven Device. While the more famous Mistel project focused on turning old bombers into giant piloted bombs, the Beethoven system was a tactical escort. The logic was terrifyingly simple. The twin-engine Dornier DO-217 had the range to strike deep into England, but it was vulnerable to night fighters. The single-engine Messerschmitt Bf 109 had the teeth to defend it, but not the legs for the journey. So, engineers welded them together. The Bf 109E or F model, its lower fuselage reinforced, was mounted on a complex tubular steel strut frame atop the Dornier. The fighter pilot sat in his cockpit for the entire flight, a prisoner in a vibrating, deafening cage. He controlled his own engine and instruments, but his flight controls were locked. For the 5-hour transit across the North Sea, he was a passenger, entrusting his life to the bomber pilot beneath him. Communication was near impossible over the roar of 3 engines. The only link was a simple lamp signal system: red for trouble, green for readiness, white for release. The engineering was a brute force solution to a strategic problem. The combined drag was enormous, the stress on the Dornier's airframe severe. But it worked. On that September night, Oberleutnant Klaus Hahn had experienced the mission exactly as designed. The long, tense ride at 18,000 feet, the bomber shuddering beneath him, the first flak bursts over the coast, the frantic dance of searchlights, then the white lamp from the Dornier's cockpit. A technician in the bomber's dorsal position would pull the release lever. Hydraulic latches would clunk open. Springs would physically shove the 109 away from its host. In that moment of separation, Hahn went from cargo to guardian. His fuel tanks were still 3/4 full. His engine was warm. He was, as intelligence reports would later grimly note, a fully operational defensive fighter, delivered to the point of maximum Allied vulnerability.
Back in Berlin, the data from the first operational Beethoven sorties was analyzed with clinical satisfaction. The composite aircraft could penetrate further, with a defensive surprise element that disrupted the entire British interception protocol. RAF controllers, tracking a single bomber blip on their radar screens, would vector night fighters toward what they believed was a solitary, vulnerable target. They had no way of knowing that blip contained a stowaway fighter, a wasp hidden inside the bomber's silhouette. For the RAF's fighter command, this was a systemic shock. Their entire defensive network, radar, ground control,
Interception tactics was built on identifying formations and assessing escort ranges. A Parasite fighter rewrote the book. Every lone bomber contact now had to be treated as a potential composite, a Trojan horse of the skies. It spread a virus of doubt through the interception rooms. It forced pilots to hesitate, to second-guess their approach, and in the skies over wartime Britain, hesitation was a currency paid in blood and fire. The Beethoven was not a war winner. It was a terror weapon, designed to inject chaos and re-establish a psychological edge the Luftwaffe had lost. And on that September night, it had succeeded perfectly. The RAF's response to the Beethoven threat was not born in a grand strategy room, but in the gritty, pragmatic minds of the men on the line. It was a counter-evolution, forced by a new and ugly predator. The first step was recognition. Intelligence pieced together clues, garbled Luftwaffe signals mentioning Beethoven Einsatz, captured German technicians who spoke of Huckapack, piggyback flights, and the hard physical evidence from crash sites. A Bf-109 recovered in Kent had distinct, unexplained stress marks and bolt fittings along its spine, matching no known German airframe design. The puzzle was complete. The Phantom had a name and a manual. New protocols crackled over the RT and were stamped on the briefing sheets. Quote, "Lone bandit rules. Any lone engine radar contact shadowing a bomber at extremely close range was to be treated as a composite until proven otherwise." The two-shot intercept. Night fighters were instructed to engage from extreme range with a long, destabilizing burst aimed at the bomber's upper fuselage before the suspected fighter could detach. The goal was not a kill, but to force the composite to break apart prematurely over the channel, where the now fuel-limited 109 would be forced to ditch. The Watchers. Coastal radar stations and observer corps posts were given new silhouettes to memorize, a DO-217 with an unnatural humped back. The psychological warfare was as important as the tactical shift. RAF propagandists leaked details to the press, not as a terrifying secret, but as a desperate, clumsy German trick. A British newsreel from late 1942, its tone dripping with mockery, described the latest Hun folly, bolting old fighters onto bombers like a child's model kit, a sure sign of a failing air force. The goal was to rob the Beethoven of its shock value, to turn awe into derision. And it worked. The Beethoven's inherent flaws became its coffin nails. The strain on the Dornier airframes was catastrophic. Several composites were lost not to enemy fire, but to structural failure, the bomber's wings simply shearing off under the chronic, unnatural load. The accident rate for the fighter pilots during docking and release was forbiddingly high. It was a weapon that killed its creators as often as its intended targets. Furthermore, the tactical landscape was shifting beneath the Luftwaffe's feet. The Mosquito, the very aircraft that had provoked the Beethoven, was now being built in the hundreds. Its speed and ceiling increased with every new mark. By 1943, Mosquito night fighter variants, equipped with centimetric radar, were hunting over Germany itself. The need for a long-range escort to protect bombers over England was becoming moot as the Luftwaffe was forced onto the defensive. The Beethoven Gerät faded from the skies as quietly as it had arrived. Its final missions in early 1943 were sporadic, desperate affairs. The program was shelved, its resources bled away to feed the failing fire of the Mistel project and other war-winning wonders. For Oberleutnant Klaus Hahn, the pilot who had dueled Gull Bennett, the end came not over London, but near Bremen. Transferred back to a standard fighter wing, he was shot down by a P-47 Thunderbolt in the summer of 1944. He survived as a prisoner of war. He never spoke of his rides on the back of the Dornier. It was a chapter of the war too strange, too anachronistic to believe. The legacy of the Beethoven was not in ruined buildings or changed battle lines. Its legacy was a scar on the mind. It proved that in total war, imagination itself becomes a weapon. The Allies had learned a brutal lesson. The enemy would not just build better planes, he would dream up new ways to make old ones horrifying. This lesson would be remembered months later, when the first V-1 flying bombs began to sputter over the Kentish coast, another grotesque, pilotless birth in the crowded sky. The era of the simple dogfight was over. The age of the calculated, mechanical nightmare had begun.